Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special event with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, one of the most brilliant experts and strategic thinkers on all things China, with a special focus today on US-Chinese relations and his must-read new book on how best to manage our strategic competition and avoid war. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Prime Minister Rudd serves as President and CEO of the Asia Society, as well as President of its Policy Institute. We're proud that he's also a member of the Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board. Most importantly for today, he knows China like few others. My greatest compliment is I've been stealing his ideas for years. He majored in Mandarin as well as in classical and modern Chinese history in college. His undergraduate dissertation was on human rights in China, which has shaped his view of and interactions with China over his entire career. He lived and worked in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Taipei through different diplomatic postings. He's met with Xi Jinping and senior leaders many, many times. He knows his stuff. In my view, his new book, and this time you saw it before on big screen, that I'll hold up my own personal copy from my neighborhood bookstore, Politics and Prose, one of the great independent bookstores of our country. And we'll put a link in the chat so that anyone listening, if anyone listening would like to buy a copy, you can just click on there. And I would say buy several for all of your friends. The associate director of our Global China Hub, James Hildebrand, is using it as an answer to any of his friends who ask him what's going on with China, US-Chinese relations. Read Kevin Rudd's new book is the answer. Today's discussion is an opportunity to hear from the Prime Minister, from Kevin, about his insights into the mindsets of Chinese and US leaders, the dynamics driving the most critical flashpoints in the relationship, and then new guardrails, and most importantly, new guardrails he proposes to help prevent the strategic competition from spiraling into armed conflict. And I think as we're watching Putin's armed conflict in Ukraine, it's a very timely book indeed. This event is being hosted by our Global China Hub, led by David Schulman, and that hub researches and devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging and amplifying the Atlantic Council's work on China across its 14 other programs and centers. David, working with James, who I spoke of earlier, are leading a whole new type of center at the Atlantic Council, much more horizontal than vertical, working together with everything from our Geotech Center, our Geoeconomic Center, where we work with the Rhodium Group on economic issues, Africa Center, our Mideast Center. China touches every part of our work, and the Global China Hub not only creates its own content, but also helps make sense and put together the other content so we understand global China, a more comprehensive look at how China is acting globally. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone in our audience in Zoom to submit questions by using the Q&A button. I'll turn to some of those questions as we go along, so please submit them all the way through. And with that, Kevin, and as a fellow author, I'd like to kick this off by just saying why this book now? It's hard to write a book, particularly with everything else you have going on in your life. Why this book now?
Well, thank you, Fred, and to Dave and to the team at Atlantic Council for hosting this event, and just to acknowledge also the extraordinary work which you at the Atlantic Council are doing for this whole raft of complex transatlantic relationships where China remains central to that dynamic as well. Why this book now? A lot of leaders around the world ask me this question. How do we avoid long-term crisis, conflict, and war between the United States and China? And these are not just Chinese leaders, these are leaders throughout Europe, these are leaders throughout Asia. And so I thought it was time to apply some disciplined thinking to that question. Secondly, whether we like it or not, Fred, if we looked at the dynamics of the China-US relationship today, it is one of strategic competition. It didn't just take H.R. McMaster to proclaim that in 2017, though I give him credit for doing so. When you peel away the language, that's the nature of the relationship, and the competition is about who becomes the dominant military, economic, and technological power in the Asia-Pacific region, and in time, the world at large between China and the United States. So for me, the core analytical question is this. At present, we have strategic competition between these two powerful countries without really any effective guardrails, without any really operational rules of the road. And for me, that makes me nervous as a historian by instinct, because I've seen so often in history where this runs off the side of the road and we end up with crisis, escalation, conflict, and war. Or alternatively, whether we can construct some de minima rules of the road to reduce the risk of crisis, conflict, and war, particularly during what I describe as this decade, the 2020s, the decade of living dangerously, where you have this emerging set of national security hotspots from South China Sea to the Taiwan Straits to the East China Sea and cyber and space. So in a nutshell, Fred, that's why I wrote it. That's why I wrote it for now. I didn't anticipate an immediate war in Ukraine, although there's a large slab of the book which deals with the underpinning dynamic of the China-Russia relationship. Back to you.
Thanks so much. When we last hosted you, it was shortly after the Xi-Putin joint statement on February 10th, but still 2 weeks ahead of the war, the invasion, with Steve Hadley. And it's one of the most popular events, most watched events we've done in the last months. And so I'm sure those who watched then will now be interested in an update from that. You did complete the book before Putin's war in Ukraine. If you were doing an updated edition right now, what impact would this have on the next edition of your book? I guess, in other words, what I'm asking is, how does the Chinese-Russian relationship as it's unfolding now factor into your thinking?
It was a good discussion we had not long ago with Steve Hadley, who I respect enormously, a national security advisor in the Bush administration, and myself, on trying to make sense of the Russia-China joint strategic declaration of 4 February. And I think we did it less than a week after that happened. We scrambled pretty quickly because I think both Steve, myself, and yourself thought this was pretty significant and brings together, if you like, in one fell swoop, the security challenges of Asia and Europe and the Atlantic in one emerging strategic condominium between Moscow and Beijing. I think the book that I've done kind of is adequate to explain what now unfolds between Beijing and Moscow. I spent quite a number of pages in the book describing the underpinning geopolitical dynamics between the Russian Federation and Xi Jinping's China. And just to quickly recap what they are: one, whatever people think may now be in Xi Jinping's interest to somehow intervene to cause Putin to change course needs to be tempered against the genuine strategic reality that Xi Jinping's view of Russia, like his predecessors, is we've had now 30 years of a benign relationship with the Russian Federation, 10 years of an increasingly close strategic collaboration with Moscow, and we like it that way, and we're not going to do nothing to disrupt it, because most of our history with Russia has been one of adverse political relations. The Tsarist period, notwithstanding the collaboration during the Bolshevik period, the Sino-Soviet split in 59, the poisonous relationship of 59-89, which provided the strategic opening for Nixon and Kissinger, and the resetting of the US-China relationship pivot against Moscow. Chinese don't want to go back to that. So from their interest is Putin's Russia is good for them strategically. And secondly, it enables Beijing to focus almost exclusively on their principal strategic adversary for this competition we spoke about at the outset, Fred, which is the United States, both regionally and globally. And finally, the Russians always provide the Chinese with a useful strategic partner by providing a rolling set of strategic distractions for the United States, both in the Middle East, as we've seen in Syria, in North Africa, as we've seen in Libya, and now most dramatically in Ukraine. So roll in some commodity supplies, that's oil, gas, wheat, and agricultural commodities, as a secure source of supply when China fears geostrategic interdiction of those supply routes in the event of a crisis with the United States. It's a very tight relationship. It's got its tensions, but the balance of forces operating in Xi Jinping's mind to hug Putin closely and the Russian Federation even closer remains the dominant strategic calculus in Moscow. In Beijing, about Moscow.
Very interesting, despite what we're seeing on our screens every day from the killing fields of Ukraine. So based on a number of factors in your book, you argue that she is approaching this year's 20th Party Congress in a strong position that, barring an act of nature, will likely be China's paramount leader through 2027 and beyond. That said, you told me a couple of weeks ago, and I quoted you in my CNBC column, that a Putin failure of whatever sort, quote, could create the chemistry necessary for a rethink of Chinese leadership inside the party. And then going on to say that Xi's control remains, quote, comprehensive, but not, quote, complete. Could you talk about that? I mean, clearly we don't know how this is going to end, but what are the stakes for President Xi personally in Putin's war?
Well, 2022, as most of those joining this program today, Fred, through the Atlantic Council, will be aware that this is the year of the 20th Party Congress due this November. It's a 5-yearly event in the cycle of the Chinese Communist Party. It determines the party leadership for the 5-year period ahead. And what's particularly significant about this one is it would end up being the 3rd term for Xi Jinping, thereby breaching the conventions laid out by Deng Xiaoping decades ago that no subsequent leaders of the party should ever serve more than 2 5-year terms. And that was to prevent a return of Mao, or a Mao-like figure, I should say. Therefore, this is a very big year in Chinese domestic politics, and we need to understand that it's no ordinary year. Xi Jinping wanted a stable year, as you referred to before, but he's got now 3 or 4 sets of headwinds rolling against him. The one you just alluded to, which is Crimea, and I'll come back to Putin in a minute. But within the Chinese system, Xi Jinping is regarded to have led Chinese Russia strategy to a level which is in excess of the normal comfort zones of the party's military and foreign policy leadership by becoming so close to Putin personally and so closely identified with, therefore, Putin's strategy in Ukraine. Secondly, a slowing economy for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is Xi's ideological decision to move the center of gravity in Chinese economic policy further towards the left, further in support of state-owned enterprises, further away from the private sector. And as a result, you've got slowing growth, which is bad politics in China. And then finally, on top of the above, you've got this rolling set of challenges coming out of the pandemic, which has jumped the border. Shanghai's in a state of lockdown. And whereas it's not generating, so far as we know, a large lethal caseload, each time you lock down a city consistent with China's domestic zero COVID strategy, you're slowing the economy again. But on the Putin factor, to come back to it, Putin having a messy outcome in Ukraine is one thing. If Putin effectively produces in Ukraine what he earlier produced in Georgia, which is a frozen conflict, and thereby takes the Donbass, consolidates Crimea, links them both with a land corridor to the southeast, in the southeast of the country. Then from Xi Jinping's point of view, and from Putin's domestic point of view, that might be sufficient to proclaim, as it were, a reasonable strategic outcome. However, if it goes very untidily for Putin, and if he was to be perceived by his own constituency in Moscow as having failed in Ukraine, and even worse, if Putin was to fall, which my Russian analytical colleagues tell me won't happen because his position is still secure within Russia. But if he was to fall, this would throw such a lightning rod into Chinese domestic politics that I think would be then down to what I'd describe as a 50-50 impossible to pick outcome for the 20th Party Congress, because Xi, under those circumstances, would have been proven to have backed a failed horse, and China does not like backing losers. And this was a leadership choice.
Fascinating answer, and obviously one that people also within the U.S. administration may want to listen to. And then that gets me to the boldest proposal in the book, which is just excellent. As we said, you can purchase it by clicking on the Politics and Prose link in the chat. Also, just to remind those listening in, if you want to pose a question to Prime Minister Rudd, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But the boldest proposal for defining U.S.-Chinese relationship is, and it was your answer to the question from Lenin himself, what is to be done? The one thing you are is just a very, very good writer on top of everything else. But as Beijing and Washington increasingly believe the other has mutually incompatible strategic aims, your answer is a quote unquote managed strategic competition. I wonder if you could define that and how it would help prevent a US-China war in the 2020s.
Yeah, this is the core of the book. First part of the book tries to explain, Fred, how we got to where we've got to in the US-China relationship. It's a quick layman's history of the relationship. And because history didn't happen last night, it's been accumulating for a while, and we are in the present because of an accumulated set of realities and perceptions of those realities. Second part of the book is to try and explain Xi Jinping's worldview in terms of how he perceives his own strategic priorities regionally and globally. And the third and critical part of the book is, as you said, paraphrasing Lenin, what then is to be done. As a bit of a student of the Cold War myself, and as a kid and as a diplomat, having served in the latter part of the Cold War during the 80s, what always struck me about the US-Soviet relationship was after the near-death experience of '62 and the missile crisis, was this. Slowly but surely, during the 60s and into the 70s and the 80s, the United States and the Soviet Union, having come so close to blowing each other's brains out, and the rest of us with you, decided that there should be some de minima protocols for managing that highly complex nuclear relationship and the underpinning geopolitical relationship. So if you look at the history of the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, there were still proxy wars rolling around the world, but it rarely got back to triggering questions of the central strategic balance and then putting us in the same sort of crisis as we faced back in '62. So there's a bit of a learning from that, in my judgment, Fred, which is even if you are in a position of having direct strategic adversaries, not even just strategic competition, that you can devise de minima rules of the road to prevent unnecessary, avoidable, or accidental conflict at least, and reduce the probability of conflict overall. The three core principles of managed strategic competition are as follows. Number one, and somewhat controversially, for each side to define clearly in its own mind and its own internal counsel its irreducible 4 to 5 strategic red lines. And the reason I pick 4 to 5 is not just its acute number, it's because they are respectively Taiwan and the sub-issues associated with it, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, cyber and space, because each of these can frankly trigger a crisis which could erupt in a matter of hours if we're not very careful about it. And having done this definitional process within Beijing and within Washington, to then at the level of the National Security Advisor of both countries to, as it were, exchange those notes. There will never be an agreement on what we'd say is a mutual set of strategic red lines, because that's almost a definitional impossibility. China wants to take Taiwan. It's not going to accept a strategic red line by the United States about Taiwan, which says, and you shall never take it. But it's useful for the Americans to articulate clearly, if you were to go past these particular points on any Taiwan-related contingency, if you were to breach those, then the consequences would be vast and would either be military, economic, or by whatever other means. And similarly for the Chinese to do the same. The second is, if there can be some clarity constructed around that, then in the context of private diplomacy at the most senior levels between the two countries, you then can have what I describe as non-lethal strategic competition across the vast remaining domains of the US-China relationship. The militaries will continue to grow and become more sophisticated. Foreign policy competition for footprint and influence around the world would continue. The economic competition in trade and investment and technology and capital markets and currency markets and talent markets would continue to unfold, as would the ideational conflict between the liberal international order and our concept of universal rights and freedoms, as opposed to the authoritarian order which China and the Russians to some extent are seeking to construct. And the final element in the logic, Fred, is this. Within such a joint strategic framework, what I call MSC, Managed Strategic Competition, there is still room for both sides to determine, based on their own national interests, those domains where they still must strategically collaborate for their own mutual benefit and for the benefit of the world. Climate change being one, the next pandemic, given how much we botched the last one, probably representing a second category of continued global health collaboration. And finally, global financial stability, given the world's two largest economies with the two largest financial systems. So that in a nutshell is what MSC is about, as opposed to the current approach, which is kind of push and probe and see what happens on a given Thursday in the South China Sea if we really shove it up the Chinese nose, or the Chinese shove it right up our nose, and let's do the Hail Mary and hope that we get through to tomorrow morning. I have an anxious view of our current approach to things.
Thank you for laying that out in the detail you did, which I thought was really useful. So my next question you anticipate and address in the book, but I'd like to give you a chance here to respond to it, and that is the counter argument that the Managed Strategic Competition, MSC, amounts to kicking the can down the road and then setting the US and China up for an even more serious confrontation in the 2030s.
Yeah, my response to that is as follows. I kind of wished we had kicked it down the road in 1914, because what happened in 15, 16, 17, 18 was generally regarded by all of us as not good. It fundamentally blew up the global order, and in many respects brought on the Bolshevik Revolution in Moscow in 1917. So if the option is kicking stuff down the road in an intelligent way, without compromising your essential principles on the way through, and preserving the peace on the way through, that of itself is not a bad thing. But the underpinning strategic logic, in addition to what I've just said, Fred, is this. One, I call this the decade of living dangerously because from Beijing's perception, this balance of power, because I'm essentially a foreign policy realist, this balance of power militarily with the United States, from their perspective, will reach some level of parity during the 2020s, at least in the Asia Pacific region. And increasingly, as they would see it, globally as well. And therefore, because you've got these live wire issues within a changing balance of power framework in the South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, all of which are about unresolved underlying territorial conflicts, it is a dangerous decade. So managed strategic competition could just help us navigate our way through the decade. Secondly, and this is why I don't run away from the ultimate question of Taiwan. The United States and the Taiwanese, it provides time to begin to restore effective deterrence, because the Chinese current trajectory is that the military balance will get better for them. Therefore, the only thing which would deter them from an attack, which I believe would be in their natural timetable sometime in the early 2030s, would be if Uncle Sam and the Taiwanese assemble a much more deterrent profile than is currently the case. Now, Indo-Pacific Command out of Hawaii is currently doing that, but it's barely a couple of years into that program. The Taiwanese, probably a couple of years into a reorientation of their own national defense, particularly deploying the sort of asymmetric warfare capabilities and systems and equipment that we've seen ably deployed by our Ukrainian friends against the Russians. And if we get therefore to 2030 and you have a more formidable US and Ukrainian presence, US and Taiwanese presence, then under those circumstances, you're more likely to avert conflict at that time. So I'm not just talking about kicking it down the road. The final piece of the logic in response to the question, though, Fred, is this. You never know. If you can get through the 2020s and maybe even the 2030s, as I've just described, you may actually bring about a new set of circumstances in the strategic thinking of the next generation of Chinese and American leaders, whereby they conceive of this competition in different terms. We don't know what the future will hold in 20 years' time. We've got some idea of the landscape over the next 10 years, and even out between the 10 and 20-year point, but we're into a quite misty future by 2040. Xi Jinping would then be hitting 90, by the way. You and I, of course, will still be in our current positions as head of the Asia Society and Atlantic Council, respectively. But the bottom line is we may find different ways of thinking. The Chinese have a term for this. It's called siwei. It's a strategic way of looking at things. All I'm trying to do is to navigate our way through the current ugliness, but in an entirely realist fashion, which doesn't believe that you either kiss goodbye to your values and our belief in freedom, nor does it believe in kissing goodbye to the fundamental disciplines of military deterrence.
It's absolutely fascinating. You don't use in any of this explanation the word containment. And so I'm just wondering, is there something Kennan-esque in what you've tried to do with this book in terms of to frame an era, but you're just, and that's managed strategic competition is today's answer to containment?
Yeah, the reason I'm a huge fan of Kennan. In fact, I'm rereading his diaries at the moment. I mean, this guy is an extraordinary individual, a remarkable intellect, and a little irascible and curmudgeonly, but we'll forgive him of all that. But a brilliant mind, and you've just got to read his stuff to know what contribution he made to the US body politic and to the world in the longer telegram and in the X article. But you see, Kennan was dealing with a doctrine and a strategy of containment against the Soviet Union at the time, whereby the Soviet Union was not a global economic power. It simply was not. China now is, and with a bigger economic footprint in many parts of the world than the United States currently has. So classic containment, which is shut down the Soviet Union's economic engagement with the rest of the world, frankly, I think is a reality which cannot be retrospectively reconstructed in the current reality. So what I'm talking about is something different. But its organizing principle is one to see us through this next critical couple of decades. As I said, our residual strength as in the democratic world, and I choose not to use the term Western world, because the democratic world is bigger than the civilizational concept of the West. The residual strength of the democratic world is two things: the power of our ideas of freedom, open societies, open politics, and open economies, and underpinned by maximum military deterrence, and if necessary, a capacity to fight and win wars if all else fails. We just need to make sure we're organized along those lines. But bringing on a premature conflict with the People's Republic of China is, in my view, completely alien to any of the underpinning strategic thinking in George Kennan's work as well, although my response is a little different to Kennan's, as you can see.
Right, and it also expresses a certain optimism about the power of our ideas and open economies and systems. Let me start to weave in a couple of questions. Also, you've mentioned a very excellent part of the book where you write about the decade of living dangerously, and you present 10 alternative future scenarios for the decade ahead in your book, half of which have to do with Taiwan. And I'll read you the question, but then I'll add my own. The question is from Mohammed Vatanka. It is obviously one of the most important disputes between US and China is sovereignty of Taiwan. During the last weeks, we've seen that the US has sent so many Patriot missiles to Taiwan. What should be done to keep peace in Taiwan? And is there a specific solution for this mutual challenge? I've had the benefit of reading the book, and you write, and I think you're right, that Americans don't realize how central Taiwan is to the party's political priorities. Maybe there is a parallel there with us having underestimated how important Ukraine was to Putin. You say that Xi's already concluded that a gradualist approach to bring Taiwan in has failed. And then you, in your scenarios, the worst case scenario you call a Munich moment, the most likely scenario, an American Waterloo. So maybe you can answer Mohammed's question, but I also wonder if you could talk about these scenarios and what might be the best way out for the US and Taiwan, and how does that come about?
Yeah, I try to push the envelope with each of those scenarios, as you can see, Fred, in order for people to conceptualize what it could actually look like. We're also horrified by the prospect of a war between China and the United States over Taiwan that we almost psychologically conditioned to avert our intellectual gaze. So I've tried to push people into thinking about what it would be. And there are 3 or 4 Taiwan-related scenarios which are worth thinking about. One is I call the America's Munich moment, which is ultimately the United States blinks. And once the Chinese launch a military action against Taiwan, large or small, that America, either through lack of political resolve or lack of military capability, elects not to move. I do not think that's probable for the simple reason that the United States, if it chose not to act, you would be kissing goodbye to the credibility of your alliance structure around the world. Now, I know Taiwan's not a treaty ally. There is no mutual defense provision in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. But let me tell you, if you're sitting in Tokyo, you're sitting in Seoul, and you're sitting in Canberra, and if you're sitting in NATO headquarters in Brussels, I think you'd be looking at whether the United States acted or not and drawing conclusions. And remember, Chinese propaganda at the moment in Asia, which is largely invisible to American eyes, is as follows. It's got nothing to do with human rights abuses in Ukraine. It's about the fact that the United States did not come to Ukraine's military assistance. That's the Chinese propaganda line in Asia directed at Taiwan and American allies in Asia at present. The second scenario I talk about is there's a military engagement between China and the United States. over Taiwan, and America loses. I call that the American Waterloo scenario, and it speaks for itself. But it does point to what Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii is now seeking to do through strong leadership, as I've seen it, which is to rectify emerging categories of imbalance, given the hardware which is available to the United States Armed Forces and its allies in East Asia and the West Pacific, and with Taiwan. The third is that I call it the American Midway moment. You actually turn this against China. You actually prevail. Remember, the Chinese have never fought in modern history a successful naval engagement. If I was to ask you, Fred, and you're a student of world history, what was the last naval battle that China fought and won? There isn't an answer. And that is, it is not a nation of long naval history. Japan has a modern naval history, and we're familiar with it in the Second World War, but also in the Sino-Russian War of 1905. Then, of course, Japan's naval engagements in the First World War of a more modest nature, and then, of course, in the Second World War. But China has no such tradition. So the idea that China would automatically prevail in what would be the largest amphibious operation since the D-Day landings, that turns out to be a midway moment, and that China loses, is a real factor in Chinese strategic and military thinking. The fourth, and this is the preferred scenario in my mind, is as follows: that enough repair work is done on deterrence in the 20s by the US, its allies, and most particularly the Taiwanese domestically themselves, to cause the Chinese leadership, on the advice of their own Central Military Commission, at decade's end and early in the 2030s, to say, we love you lots, Comrade Xi Jinping, but we don't believe we can pull this off without taking an enormous strategic risk. That's where I think this strategy of mine seeks to get us to, Fred.
Thank you so much for that excellent answer. A lot of questions coming in, and I'll get as many of them in as I can. Alex McDonald says, Dear Kevin, please, could you comment on the possibility of China increasing its influence and power over the next decade in established international institutions, IMF, United Nations? Could the US still facilitate power sharing, make concessions with China in these institutions to enable a condominium with China in global governance? And you do write about a new world order and how China views this, and the fact that it seems to not have a blueprint yet. So perhaps you could answer Alex's question and also deal a little bit with how you've had addressed this in the book.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for the question. And I try to outline Xi Jinping's thinking about an alternative international order in the 10th of my 10 concentric circles of interest surrounding Xi Jinping's overall worldview. And there's a bit of writing on it so far in the Chinese system. I've tried to analyze it and understand where I think they're going. But here are its two essential prongs so far. One, we, China, through the existing UN and Bretton Woods machinery of the bank, the fund, and the WTO, will increase our funding, our presence, our personnel, and frankly, our ability to take control of a number of institutions within that system, or at least influence them much more decisively than's been the case so far. And that's been China's operational strategy as I've observed it since about 2015. And if you look at institutions around the world, Chinese lead 4 or 5 of the major institutions under the UN system. China's currency is now a recognized reserve currency in the SDR basket of the International Monetary Fund. Of course, China has become a much more active presence in the World Trade Organization. And across all these platforms has said, particularly during the Trump administration, we, the Chinese, are now the upholders of this UN multilateral system. Those crazy Americans under Trump, they just walked away from it. They resigned from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They junked their membership of so many other institutions, etc. Of course, the problem which the Russian invasion of Ukraine presents and China's tacit support for Putin's Moscow on this question is there's no more fundamental violation of the UN Charter than to invade the sovereign territory of another nation state. But the other prong to China's global order strategy is to create a parallel set of institutions. You see that most spectacularly with the Belt and Road Initiative. You see it most spectacularly with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. To a lesser extent, you see it with the New Development Bank, and you see it with China's +1 arrangements with every region in the world. Atlantic Council's active in Latin America, for example, for the Latin Americans +1 meeting, CELAC. The Eastern Europeans +1, 16 +1, 17 +1, depending on whether Greece is in or out. And similarly, ASEAN +1 in Southeast Asia. You put all these institutions together, it is about a more Sino-centric world. And that's how China sees it. I think the most creative and constructive thing to do at this stage, particularly given the common global challenge on climate, is to use the collaborative mechanisms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to work both the US and China within the rules of the system, and to demonstrate that Chinese leadership, together with American leadership, can work in this single defined domain, which is in the national interests of both countries to do so. If you do that, you never know, it may have a transformative impact. Remember I spoke earlier, Fred, about changing the way of thinking, the Sui. It may have a reverse engineering approach back into the rest of the, shall I say, hard realist approaches currently prevailing in the other instruments of global governance. But on balance, China's trying to basically say, well, Uncle Sam, since the Second World War and building off what you did with the Monroe Doctrine in the Americas, our time in the sun has come. We're going to construct an order along similar lines. You did so by drafting the rules when you were the world's largest economy. We're about to become the world's largest economy, we hope, unless we screw up the economic development program within China itself. So get ready for a China-led order with China-led norms and institutions. That's currently the bulk of the thinking under Xi Jinping. And that's why, if you don't share those views, and you have a different view of global norms and institutions, it's absolutely critical the United States, Republican or Democrat, and the Europeans and others defend the architecture of the existing international system.
Thank you. A question from a member of the Atlantic Council Board, Frank Kramer, from whom I've also stolen a lot of ideas over the years. And how his question is, how should globalization and economic—
Hey Fred, we steal stuff from you too. You just need to know that. So.
Well, one hopes. But the question is, how should globalization and economic relations change in the context of managed strategic competition?
That's an excellent question. And it is probably one of the most complex of all the complex questions I seek to address in the book. We stand back from it for a moment, Fred, and we talk about this thing called the international rules-based order, or the liberal international order. What the hell are we talking about? Well, it's worth a moment's reflection. We could say, well, it means the UN system, the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, and all that stuff. And it plays a vital role, both in terms of legitimacy and norm setting, but as Zelensky said the other day to the UN Security Council, hey, there's a security crisis unfolding before your eyes. It's a violation of the UN Charter. A permanent member of the UN Security Council has just invaded the sovereign territory of another state, and you're sitting there and doing nothing about it. Either act or self-dissolve. But let's just push that to one side. I thought it was the most powerful piece of international polemics I've seen from a political leader about the UN Security Council since Khrushchev banged the table with his shoe in the late 50s and early 60s. The second part of the order are the Bretton Woods institutions. And there's a third part of the order, which are this, shall I say, emerging global institutions like the G20, which, while not anchored in the UN Charter and not anchored in Bretton Woods, have sought to fill gaps in global economic governance. But underpinning all three And the convening power of all three has been the underlying power of the United States of America and its capacity through the power of the dollar and the global reach of the US military to act as the ultimate, as it were, strategic ballast of the system. So when I think of the international rules-based order or the liberal international order, that's what I mean. And globalization, as we've experienced, economic globalization through the 90s and the noughties and into the decade just past, has occurred as a consequence of those 3 to 4 sets of, shall we say, arrangements. Now, if you end up with instead a China-based global order, the pattern of globalization, which is anchored in open economies and to some extent open societies and to some extent open political systems, begins to change radically. And you begin to see, in fact, instead, the emerging alternative order is one which begins to characterize China's engagement with the Belt and Road Initiative countries, or you begin to see a type of globalization which has the renminbi as its center. You begin to see a set of security relationships which are focused increasingly on assisting nation states with their internal surveillance systems, as opposed to the free flow of peoples. It's quite a different nature of international collaboration which would emerge. And if you want to see the early precursor in the chemistry laboratory of global geopolitics, have a good look at the BRI.
Fascinating. A couple of questions that are somewhat related, so I'll turn to both of them. Chris Davis asks a question speaking to your analogy of 1914. Says the argument could be made that World War I began in 1914 because some parties, for example, the German military leadership, felt they could not kick the can down the road in order for a future conflict to be winnable. And the question, very good question, do you feel either side today is thinking in now or never terms? And because clearly Putin was thinking in now or never terms on Ukraine. You've said that Xi Jinping sees that Taiwan is not necessarily going in the right direction. And then linked to that question is one from Kelly McDermott. How do you build enhanced deterrence in Taiwan during this decade without provoking a quicker response from China? How will they respond in the short term? So it's somewhat related questions.
They're both excellent questions, Fred. And for those of us who look at this question from the perspective of grand strategy, both in the United States and from the perspective of the Chinese, and the existential questions of continuity of their own political arrangements, the Taiwanese, this actually goes in some respects to the core of it. What I outlined before was, if you like, this 3-stage process. Navigate the decade of living dangerously through many strategic competition. 2, on the American side, seek to enhance deterrence during the course of that decade, both through America's own military power, its collaboration with its partners and allies, and Taiwanese indigenous, shall we say, defense resilience, so that China then is ultimately deterred from acting in the 2030s. And then thirdly, see what then happens by the time you get to the 2040s in terms of different ways of looking at the future of the US-China relationship. Because ways of thinking do change, as we've seen 30 years ago, ways of thinking strategically about these questions was radically different to what we face today. Now, the strategic whole and the logic of the argument is the one that your 2 questioners have just put in highly intelligent form, Fred, which is, okay, you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar sitting in Beijing to work out, so this is what those pesky Americans and their Taiwanese friends are up to. Therefore, it alters our own preferred strategic timetable, which is late 20s and early 30s. By the way, why is it late 20s and late 30s? It's not just that China wants an overwhelming military balance, which it doesn't currently have. There's still military risk along the lines I referred to before. If you did go to war tomorrow, big risk, in fact. But secondly, you are enormously financially vulnerable to the United States dollar-denominated international financial system, which is why China, as of today, is complying with the US unilateral sanctions regime against the Russians, because they know secondary sanctions against themselves for non-compliance would deliver enormous financial and economic damage to the Chinese economy. And until such time as China's economy and financial system is big enough and ugly enough to float the renminbi and to liberalize the Chinese capital account and create a genuine alternative to the US dollar in global foreign exchange markets and currency markets, then China will continue to face that risk. So they're the two underpinning arms of the argument as to why it's a late 20s, early 30s scenario in preferred Chinese strategic timetabling on Taiwan rather than anything nearer term. So if the Chinese leadership look at the equation that we've just painted, what will their conclusion from that be? They may say, militarily, we should strike while the iron is not hot, but while the iron is warmer earlier. However, within pure military terms, if there is already caution now about acting militarily early on, because the military imbalance of power in the Taiwan Straits is not overwhelming in China's advantage, is reasonable, and desktop wargame exercises demonstrates that it's reasonable. You cannot afford to lose such a war. If you lost such a war and you had a midway scenario, Fred, that is, the Americans did act and you and the Allies were decisive in the Taiwan Straits, and the Taiwanese resistance was as formidable domestically as we've seen from Ukraine against Russia, the Chinese Communist Party leadership would fall. And arguably the Communist Party, it would be so delegitimizing in terms of domestic political legitimacy to bring on a war over Taiwan and not to prevail decisively. But I think the real kicker in the argument is the financial and economic one. If you were in Beijing and you were providing the briefing paper to the Central Military Commission about going early on Taiwan because of this scenario that we've been discussing in this set of discussions today, the overwhelming argument would be, how do you get around the financial and economic risk to the crippling of the Chinese economy? Of course, taking such financial action against China is also an act of mutually assured financial and economic destruction for the US and China, because if you basically seek to cripple the Chinese economy, that's a vastly different order of magnitude in terms of its reverse impact back into the United States than actions against an economy like Russia's. The Russian economy, by the way, is the same size as the Australian economy. You just need to put this into context. It is a medium power at best. But against China, you're dealing with the second largest lump of activity in the world. So the reverberations for the US would be strong as well. But from the Chinese perspective, they would regard that as a financial and economic risks too large to take. So for those reasons alone, I think the logic of the schema that I outlined still holds.
Thank you so much. We've only got a few minutes left. Let me turn to economic question, and I'll link two again. There's one from John Cudahy. From a Western business point of view, is this a good, bad, or neutral time to enter China? And we've got a lot of business people at the Atlantic Council who would like to have your advice on that. The link to that is a question of Xi Jinping's business direction, which you do write about in the book, and how he has made a choice, a leftward move, as you've said, in favor of the party over the market. But might he be forced off of that by just the facts of growth? And so they're not the same question, but again, they're linked.
Yeah, these are important questions for all of us and for all of the business leaders who support the Atlantic Council, the Asia Society. And Atlantic Council is now supported by the Rhodium Group, and I know those guys very well. We've worked with them in the past, and they are great analysts of the economy in China. And so the questions posed in both those folks' remarks, Fred, are important. Let me take the second one first, which is, in China's case, given slowing growth, has Xi Jinping got to back off ideology in order to get growth rolling again? That's my crude Australian summary of the question. The bottom line is that actually is the nature of the challenge, but I'm not sure he's intellectually equipped to respond in a manner which would restore confidence to the Chinese private sector. You see, the Chinese private sector, I'm sure you've got a saying in American English, which is once bitten, twice shy. Well, if you don't, that's an Australian expression, which is if you get bitten by an animal, then you're likely to get bitten again. You become much more cautious in your second approach. When you've had a series of measures undertaken by Xi Jinping in recent times on the economy, which have quite clearly sent out negative signals to the Chinese private sector, then the idea that with a policy U-turn or with a policy 90-degree shift, which we see some evidence of in central leadership statements on the economy over the last 3 months, December last year through to March this year, on tech platforms, on the role of the private sector more generally, and on pushing off the common prosperity agenda into the never never, as we'd say in Australia, long way away. The question to ask yourselves is, does the Chinese private sector wake up the next morning and say, well, thank God that problem's gone. I trust the government again. And it's all going to be influenced by what has been a significant series of shifts in the last 4 years under Xi Jinping, which have been adverse to the private sector's interests. The Chinese would say, well, that only affects the big tech platforms, the big companies, the billionaire class. There's a whole bunch of new entrepreneurs coming through. They're not going to be as cantankerous as some of these older billionaires, and they'll do what the party says and earn a mozza on the way through. Not so sure about that, but I think that is the dynamic currently at play. And I'll finish on this one, Fred. On the first question you're asked, which is, if you're an American corporate and you're thinking about going into China, should you still do it? I suppose my answer would be twofold. It depends on your sector. That's an easy cop-out. But I see so far with AmCham surveys in China itself, that 80% plus of American corporates aren't planning to remove themselves. The allure of the Chinese domestic consumer market is still real and it's still big. And there's not a huge disruption yet on the ground of global supply chains involving China. There is some disruption. And the final point is this: there are some sectors where China, for its own interest, is opening the door even wider right now. But the one that I could most particularly draw your listeners' attention to is the financial services sector. A whole series of liberalizations have occurred because the Chinese want and need still as much foreign capital and, shall I say, credit market software for their own domestic growth purposes as they can get. So if that's your deal and if that's your business, then I think there's still an open door for you. But bear in mind 2030, if my logic holds true.
Mr. Prime Minister Kevin, I have so many more questions. I was going to ask about what do you mean by Marxist nationalists with Xi Jinping, ask about Europe as a key target for China's global strategy, ask about the Quad and the competition for India, but we have run out of time. And so if you want answers to those questions and many more, buy the book. Let me turn to you for any final thoughts you might have, Kevin, but thank you so much for taking this hour with us. It was such a rich, rich discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. I think the thing I just conclude on is, given the nature of the Atlantic Council, is Europe matters, really does matter. It's not just because it matters on the question of Russia-Ukraine. The one question which the Chinese leadership constantly ask themselves internally, I believe, is the reputational damage China has suffered over Putin's actions in Ukraine by China's tacit support for Putin, is it short-term or long-term? The deep realist view in Beijing is, the Europeans, they will suffer strategic amnesia by Christmas, let alone next year. And so we are quite prepared to suffer short-term reputational damage because ultimately their judgment is Europe strategically soft, and the market of China will still be hard and alluring, and will ultimately cause the Europeans to drift away from the United States. Now, that is the way in which China is currently thinking about this. And that's why you see some efforts by the Chinese to say to the Europeans, we can help a little bit at the margins on Ukraine. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, for the first time spoke to his Ukrainian counterpart the other day. Xi Jinping has not yet picked up the phone, to the best of my knowledge, to Zelensky, despite Ukrainian requests to the same. But my overall point to your constituency, Fred, in the Atlantic Council, which is to the European side of what you do, is that Europe really matters to Beijing, and therefore it matters to the future of global strategy in responding to China's rise.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for everybody for tuning in from across the globe. And I hope to see you again soon, Kevin. And thank you for this book. Really a remarkable piece of work.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Atlantic Council. All the
Bye.
best to everybody.